sitting in the back, they won't have places to sit, so they'll have to come and sit up in front for you. So anyone who feels brave, please come up and sit in the front. This is our closing plenary. I guess this is plenary 5 out of 5. Plenary 6 out of 6. We have 3 speakers who have all come in from far away to join us. We have Ana Morales from the Maverick Collective, Sebastian Frias from the Kellogg Foundation, and Selena from, she's the only one I know, Selena de Sola from Glasswing International, here for a discussion about stigma and social exclusion as it relates to racism and gender. Come on down. You're the next contestant on NEXUS Plenary 6.
Thank you, Jonah. So, can we open those doors up, David? And can you give a holler that $1 million is about to be given away to people in this room? Right? He's doing it. Now we're going to see if NEXUS members are actually motivated by money. I hope the answer is no, but we're going to find out very soon. Yeah. Here. So, I'm here to introduce you to a friend and mentor who needs a microphone. This is the 6th plenary. This is how this works. We go as we go. Here we go. So I have Ana Morales here with me, who's coming from London. So you win the award, perhaps, for the farthest travel, along with our friends from Argentina and Chile. And I asked her to do a fireside chat with me just to begin the session because her story and journey in philanthropy is very interesting and unique. So I'd love for you to say, just very briefly, how did you get started with philanthropy?
Yeah, so I come from a family who had a family business, and my grandfather, who started that business, always gave back to the community, and he had his own organization in the north of Mexico, which focused on that community and the growth of that community. So I worked with him on and off since I can remember. And from that, I decided to step away from the family at one point because, well, things were changing after my grandfather passed away, but also I wanted to learn what I was interested in and what I wanted to do, regardless of my family, which turns out is very similar, but I'm doing it my way versus how I was always taught to do it. So when I stepped away, I took a couple years off, and then I actually decided that, it was time to come back because no matter how many different careers I tried, I ended up working at nonprofits. It was actually at a NEXUS dinner that my current path started. I met Kate Roberts, who was one of your panelists, and then we started talking, and I ended up kind of finding out that where my interests lie. So I joined Maverick, which focuses on women and girls' welfare, and since then I've just started working in that area in a much more direct and intense way.
So for those of you who don't know Maverick, Maverick is a group of young women, I guess young and young at heart, we'll say, who are committed to a multi-year process as a cohort in really discovering what is the impact they want their philanthropy to make, and they determine themselves a project and a community to go in deep with and really do a lot of analysis and work and giving side by side with the community, I would say. Yeah. So can you tell us what is, I'm gonna ask a harder one actually. So what was your family tradition in giving to, and then what was the community and the project you decided through Maverick to be your focus?
So my family foundation focused on health education, community growth, and sports. And it was very small and it was very local, and basically it was whatever my grandfather said is what was done. So there wasn't really room to grow and explore and see what other areas there was. When I decided to go out on my own, I wanted to find a way where I could make much more impact, bigger impact on a global scale versus very local. And my partnership with Maverick, with PSI, has been very educational in the way that, part of my fear was actually that I didn't know how to do this because I don't have a background. I don't have an education in global development or anything of the sort. But I found that partnering with people that actually do is a great way to, fulfill what I wanted to do. And then after that, I have actually found other partnerships, which one of them is here, to work with and, make that global impact. So the project I chose in El Salvador with Maverick is working with women and girls in health reproduction, health education, but not necessarily directly with girls. Although I do think that we need to support women and help them grow and empower them, I think that at this point in time, it's such in fashion to do that people are forgetting that there's the other side of the coin. Nobody's really working, not nobody, there are people, but people focus more on women and girls. But I like working with men and boys and educating them in that area, like masculinity and who are you in this and how do you work to make the community a better place. So I looked for a project that worked in behavior change with men and boys.
Amazing.
Which actually is a segue
yes,
to the
there
panel.
you go. Very well done, Anna. So today Anna's going to lead a conversation with a partner that she has and a friend about investing with a gender lens with an interest towards men and boys, and also the importance of looking at not just a gender lens, but also inclusion in general.
Yes, and
racism. And so I think, honestly, gender and race are very interlinked as well, and don't get as much attention as perhaps they should. So I'll let you welcome up your panelists and bring up another chair, and thank you so much for having them here.
So you've heard a little bit about me, so I'm going to skip that part. But I want to introduce Selena de Sola and Sebastián Frias, and I'm going to let them tell you who they are in a very short period of time, keeping time in mind. So could you guys give us an elevator pitch about the organization and the work you do with it, please?
I'm Selena de Sola, and I'm a social entrepreneur, and I co-founded an organization that works to keep youth away from violence and enables them to thrive. We work throughout some of the most violent communities in Latin America in 12 different countries, and we do that in partnership with government, private sector, and civil society. For us, the civic participation and making sure communities drive their own transformation is really important.
Hello, my name is Sebastián Frias. I work for the Kellogg Foundation. I'm based out in Mexico City. I'm part of our Latin America and the Caribbean team. And I would like to mention that there's 3 components of our work. We do place-based work, so we are actually right now working only in 25 communities, indigenous communities in Southeast Mexico, and in 2 microregions in Haiti. But I think what I want to mention about the work of the foundation is that we use 3 components to it. One is racial equity, the other is community engagement and leadership, and we think these 3 things are part of our DNA. I'll talk more about our lens or our framework towards racial equity, but that's pretty much what we're doing. We've been investing in the region since 1930. So there's a lot of experience and different types of work we've been supporting.
So Sebastián, could you give us an example of one of your projects, and then what does success look like, and how do you measure it?
Sure. I would like to start saying that the way we look at racial inequality and how to progress to racial equity is basically, we think that the legacy of colonialism and oppression in the continent has led to a false hierarchy of human value. And so what does this mean? Basically that a group of people are seen less valuable than other group of people based on their skin color, their gender, their class. So when you look at this, this way, you start to understand the barriers, the structural barriers that are imposed, and it's not. I think our interest is that this is a social construction, and since we built this, we can unbuild it or change it. So that's where the opportunity is, right? So if this is a social construction, we can change our reality. I thought about a very specific case to mention, just to know, or to mention what success looks like for us. I think the key questions is who is taking the decisions. So that's why I mentioned community engagement. I think for us, when the community is actually leading any effort, that's success for us, because it's not common. Many of the indigenous communities we work in are being imposed infrastructure projects that they don't want or need. But if they have a say on that, for us that's success, no? Also, who is designing the solutions? If we have communities being part of the design team of the solutions, not just at the center of the design of the initiatives or projects, but actually leading the design of initiatives, that's success for us. And also, another thing that is very important for us is that they define what success is. You know, so have communities define for us what success is, not us with our indicators. And of course, we do have indicators. Of course, we have a responsibility against our board, but it's really understanding how they defined success. And I think that's a very different perspective that we've been trying to support. So the case I want to mention is, of course, Chiapas, I don't know, for the people that are not familiar with the region, produces a lot of coffee, very, very good coffee, gourmet coffee. And these lands were owned, subtracted by the local people and owned by fincas and other type of industries. And so we know that the people that live right now in Chiapas, the indigenous people that actually produce coffee, had to fight, or their grandparents had to fight to recover their lands. And I think that's very meaningful because there's a history and a lack of access to that land, and the struggle they had to do to get it back. And then they know the process of the coffee from seeding to a cup, roasting, every single step of the process, they know it. I think that's also interesting because you don't always see that in coffee co-ops. They're organized as a co-op, so this means they are their own stakeholders. Their interest is in the community. I think there's a specific coffee co-op that took 10 years to get to where they want it. So that's also, I think, a different view. Change won't happen in a year. And that's clear for us. We're investing in these communities at least for a generation, because we've seen since the 30s that if you invest in something a year or less or more, sometimes it's not enough. So to create systemic change and impact, you'll have to be there at least a midterm to long term. So this co-op started producing coffee. They started getting better at it. They got a client in Japan. The client said, you know what, we want you to roast the coffee because we think it'll be better if you send us the product already roasted. So they took a group of the community members to Japan. They trained them. They supported with capital to create the technology, the plant. And along the way, a lot of different consultants told them, you know, you're doing great. Why don't you move the plant near the ocean? Because it'll be easier. Your logistics will be better. You'll start exporting more. And they said, no, you know, our interest is the community. We don't care if we'll get more money faster. What we want to do is develop our community. We need to have the jobs here. We need to do it our own way. So they did, and they had to struggle with international prices of coffee. But then they said, no, what if we start selling the coffee in a cup? And it's really cool to hear them, because they tell you that 1 kilo of coffee, gourmet premium quality roasted, costs 200 pesos. But if you sell it in a cup, it's 1,500. So that's a huge difference. Now we know why Starbucks is so successful. So for me, what's interesting about this story is that I've talked to them several times. I've visited them. I've gone to the coffee plantations, and they tell you how they experience racism. They tell you becoming a barista and going to a contest in Seattle was really hard, because people were complaining, why is a coffee producer also a barista? And at the end, they won. Going to Japan, to a different culture, to learn how to roast coffee was really difficult. But then they tell you how being an entrepreneur, an indigenous entrepreneur, is not, you're not treated equally. You're always treated as indigenous, in the way that a huge bank came to them and said, you know what, we want to help you. We are really into community, and we really want to help you. So we're going to give you a loan. And they said, well, thank you very much, but we don't need a loan right now. Our company's doing great. And they said, why don't you, instead of giving us a loan, introduce you to all of your direct clients and give us access to your huge client portfolio. And the bank said, well, you know, I don't think they'll take you serious. And I can't say the name of the bank, but it was a very important, big international bank who did this. But I guess what I'm trying to get to is, we see all of those barriers that are there, and I think if we really take a time to analyze them and take a shot at designing with the community solutions that will actually lift those barriers, that's anti-racist actions. For us, that's actual anti-racist actions. So that's one case I wanted to share.
Thank you. And Selena, so tell us a little bit about who your stakeholders are, and how do you work with them? How do you work with them?
Well, it's kind of, and I like being here. I haven't been to Nexus before, but I think there's an interesting opportunity, you know, with what Sebastian said, and I think to think about stakeholders in general. Our model at Glasswing is we work with a lot of corporations, we work with a lot of companies, we work with government, and we also work with communities. So this idea of co-creation, and I think a lot of us try to innovate, whether it's through impact investing or developing projects or implement. And I think the richness that we're sometimes missing out on is in developing these models that really, that actually, if you're considering someone a consumer and you're developing something that we consider will improve someone's life, it's going to be even better, and there's going to be a greater demand for it if they're part of the design process. So that's the same with us when we develop our programs, whether they have to do with masculinities or mindfulness or extracurricular programs. I think it's, you know, I think it was Camila earlier was talking about remembering. For us, we're most accountable because of the nature of what we do. We're most accountable to the communities we work with. So that's our main stakeholder, the young people, the young students, and the kids that we're trying to keep out of the gangs, or we're trying to keep away from violence. We have the highest femicide rates in the world, highest homicide rates in the world. So that's the main stakeholder. But what we see in also is that sometimes that stakeholder is also a liability to other stakeholders. So when we work with government, if we work with textile companies, or we work with energy or whatever company, sometimes the communities around the companies are actually perceived as a liability, either because there's extortion or because it's dangerous, or their employees leave at 8 or 10, depending on their shifts. So all of a sudden, we have to figure out as an organization, how do we work with these different stakeholders to try to convert what can be a liability for a company into an asset? And I'm talking about these are human resources. So for us, it's really an interesting process to be able to work with these different stakeholders, including government, which is also an important stakeholder for a business and for a community, on identifying what the priorities are in a community, what the challenges are in a community, and where we can figure out, in the case of mostly Central America and the Caribbean, where we're working, where we can identify those kind of points of convergencia. And in our cases, it's mostly violence. And we've had a lot of incidents where the kids who would extort employees on the way out or would scare, companies, in some cases, scare them enough to have them leave the country, which is terrible for the national economy also. We've been able to turn that around and work with kids to, based on what they're interested in, to change the way they engage with their neighbors and end up being employed or even becoming managers within these companies. So for us, it's the stakeholder engagement is key, and I think the government, we're in a space where we can really innovate, and we've talked a lot about innovation and a lot about impact investing, but really Nexus and other spaces, if, when we talk about what, and I think a woman from the Ford Foundation asked yesterday, what does impact mean? So we kind of throw that word around, and we got to really think about that, right? If we want to change the world, which I think all of us do, or we want to change our communities, we have to really think about that. Who are we accountable to? You're accountable to your investors, but you're also accountable to who you're trying to impact. So for us, that combination of working with communities and then also partnering with the government when you can actually scale something is key for us. But ultimately, what we're trying to do is make sure that young people in the countries where we work have access to the opportunities that they're interested in having, and making sure that they thrive, literally survive and thrive. So we've been able to work with tens of thousands of kids consistently, long term, because of our partnerships and because of the different stakeholders we're working with.
So, Sebastian, you said something very interesting when you were talking about how this is a cultural thing, how we created it and we can undo it. And the question here is, how do we create long-term systemic change at a scale for both of you? How do you think that this issue, which is huge and it's global, how are we going to change it? How are we going to create that systemic change?
So I would start saying that this is my first time in Nexus too. I'm very happy to be here, but this is definitely not my a comfort zone for me. I'm not used to talking to a crowd like all of you. My work is more in the field, talking to community members, very different logic. But I'm really glad that I'm so uncomfortable right now. I'm really, really, really appreciative of this. Because I think it's only in discomfort that I can thrive, that I can harness my creativity. And I think this reflection for me is if we want to make change, if we want to make systemic change, we need to be able to cope with being uncomfortable. The first time I heard someone say there was a huge racism issue in Mexico, I was very uncomfortable and mad and said, no, we have class issues, we have gender issues, but this is not about race. But that stuck to me. It really stuck, and I'm here right now working for an international foundation doing work against racism. Why? Because I realized, maybe these barriers are not as it's not a crazy idea to think that there are certain barriers that we privilege lighter skin, and what does that translate into actual practices in our day-to-day lives. And I think being uncomfortable is what really will take us to innovation. Maybe the problem is not access to something. Maybe the problem is we're not having equal relationships with the people we're working. Maybe the problem is not lack of capacity or proficiency in a theme. Maybe it's that we're not approaching communities in their language, in the way they talk, in the way they conceive the world. So I think indulging these ideas can really get us into really creative spaces and innovation. And I think, as I said, also this long-term approach, not thinking that things will change with a magic solution and scale. I also, I've been thinking recently that, yeah, of course scale is important, but maybe it's the scale of communities coming together to solve their own problems. If we scale that, that would be great. If we engage in our neighborhoods every day, if we actually think of practice. And so we could talk all day about theory and talk about history and, you know, the colonialism, but actually that translates into day-to-day practices, the way we show up with people, the way we handle ourselves with community. And if we really want to work with them, we really need to start changing those practices, start letting them lead us, letting them teach us, being more humble. I think I heard a lot of conversations around inequality. Well, inequality is that. Inequality is not only a 1% and wealth, and money is just a proxy of power. And what does that mean? It means that we change our way we relate to people. So I think that creates sustainable change. If we transform power relationships, if we actually let people lead, give space to people to create, and actually try to cope with being uncomfortable. As I said, I think that's very, very important to learn how to deal with that and just suck it up. Because I mean, if you go to communities, if you experience poverty, if you have ever felt less valuable, then I think you'll start to understand why a lot of things happen. So.
Yeah, I mean, that's always the question. I think when we want to, and I don't know, I probably differ on the scale question, actually. I'm a big fan of trying to scale. Not necessarily quickly, but scale. And again, I think in this context, I think people were talking about how the Nexus network can be leveraged. I think this kind of how we approach development, how we approach social impact and changing the paradigms a little is really important about how we interact in the power dynamic. For me, I think there's also really cool opportunity. If you think about government can't innovate very much because the implications of messing up are huge on millions of people, potentially hundreds of thousands. So when you have like a group of you who are looking to invest, whether it's philanthropically or for profit, there's a really interesting opportunity to innovate, whether in your approach and how you identify what kind of social impact you want to have, what kind of projects you want to invest in. If we innovate more in this space, in the space of the private sector, and partner with organizations or institutions that have the rigor and measure the impact and have proven and actually evaluate what works, we can take that to scale, I think, if you partner with government. So I think that there's an interesting opportunity also to think about developing models, but also developing models for impact within the public sector, which can then be scaled. So I think structural and systemic change is a question of approach and the way you're approaching the stakeholders, but it's also a question of pushing innovation not to just generate a market in a certain space, but really think about how we can change structural issues that are preventing populations from being able to have greater poder adquisitivo, desarrollo, capacidades to be in the formal economy. So I think the kind of public-private, driven by the demand of the community and the population and civic engagement are the ways to, I think, create structural and systemic change.
Thank you. So we have time for a few questions. Anybody have questions for the panel? No? So I'm going to take advantage and ask you one more question, which I hadn't told you, but we talked about racism and we talked about change in communities, but even though that's what I talked about at the beginning, can you tell me, or can you tell us why masculinities, why educating about masculinities is important in this in the gender equation?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are organizations, for those of you who are from Brazil, Pro Mundo, I think is one of the most well-known organizations that's worked with masculinities. First of all, it's half the population, and I'm a public health person, so I come from, I've done a lot of work with reproductive health and reproductive rights, and masculinity isn't just a question of the relationship with women and girls, but also just, it's, there are so many different factors that come into behavioral and cultural and stigma and paradigms. And I think, and particularly with issues of violence, the issues of violence we face and the expectations that Latin America has of men and boys and their role in society is something that I think we really have to think about, because our economies aren't going to grow. And is anybody here, how many people here from Honduras, Guatemala, or El Salvador? And there aren't that many of us, but highest homicide rates in the world, right? So we've had students killed. I have 3 colleagues whose kids have been killed. It's a serious problem, and from an economic perspective. In Brazil, we heard about statistics from Brazil and violence. So the issue of masculinity, and I think it goes alongside also issues of opportunity and access to opportunity, and the reduction of stigmas around young males. And even for those of you who live here, there are issues of migration and what role the male plays in the household. So masculinity can't be left out of the equation, even though it's important and amazing to invest in girls and women, but we can't just work with girls and women.
So in your work with communities, have you all found that there's a particular size of community, the actual numbers of people that is ideal or optimal for working with? Thousands versus a few hundred versus millions. I mean, where do you make the most impact? Size.
So for us, our microregions are around 200,000 people, the size, and that has allowed us to engage with the community in a much more significant way. It's been a challenge, but that has really let us work with them and create a plan for 10 years that the community actually created, that they were all engaged, and it's not just like consultations or diagnosis, but the actual community led this process, this planning process, and this priority recollection. So I think we found that it was a good number, although if you ask me if we had to do it again, I probably say we would choose a bit smaller size of community. Maybe 100,000 would be a little bit more manageable.
So we work through the public infrastructure. So we don't give money to government directly, but we work through public schools and through public clinics. So for us, we find that there's a natural convening power in a public institution. And even kids who are out of school or dropped out, you can get to them through the public school. We work directly about 2 hours a week, year-round, with about 30,000 youth in our youth programming, and it has to be long-term. It can't be, going with what you said, it can't be an intervention. It can't be one-off. And I think that it's in several countries, but I think that spills over into the community. We did a study. We do studies constantly to figure out, like drug studies, randomized control trials. And we think that, if you impact through something like a school, like an institution like that, you can really impact the family, and there's a spillover effect that's actually measurable. So we see it as kind of the unit of intervention as opposed to just the family. The kind of census of a population.
Hi, thank you, first of all, for a very rich and important conversation that we're having here. I have two questions. One is, you guys are working in communities that are suffering a lot of stress, a lot of challenges. Do you see any role for impact investing in the work that you do, or is it kind of a different world? And specifically around for-profit business models that could perhaps attract more capital into solving the problems that you're working on. So that's the first question. Second one is, you also both talked about how it's important to get all of the stakeholders at the table to kind of co-create together, to really listen to the community. And I'm just curious if you have any examples of how you have seen that process work in practice. So is it, you bring stakeholders together for 3 days and nobody leaves or goes to the bathroom until, you've solved the problem together. But, bringing it down to reality of sort of how that works and what you've seen working would be helpful. Thank you.
Sure. No, I definitely think there's a role and a place for impact investment. As I said, I think maybe it's not always what the traditional way we've thought about it, but definitely I think what co-ops, and I'm talking about co-ops because that's the kind of organization we work with a lot on the economic side. I think what they really need is to be recognized as entrepreneurs that are working on the same level and not as charity, and they need to be seen as businessmen, and that's what they're looking. And I think if we get to that level of communication and also serving as facilitators, not as leaders, but as facilitators of processes, I think that's a very different way to engage. And a very specific example, we had been working with a community council that was not a government figure, but a citizen figure in an indigenous community. They've been planning on all sorts of issues, prioritizing their needs. And when a grantee comes to us and say, we want to invest in education, in infrastructure, instead of us saying, okay, yes, let me see your proposal, we tell them, please talk to the community. They know their priorities. They know where they need school infrastructure. And it's the community that then says, okay, we want to partner with this grantee specifically in these terms, in these schools. It's a long process. It has taken us at least 5 years to get there, and with different levels of success. But we don't have organizations just coming and telling us, we have a great project that's going to solve X, Y, and Z. We have the community vetting projects and saying, this is what we need, this is not what we need. So that's a real example of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think, just to give you an example of it from our work, I think we talked a lot about ecosystem here, and I think we can talk about an ecosystem in which we all participate who are sitting here, but I think we need to amplify or broaden the ecosystem of entrepreneurs. I know it took me at least 2 years to get a development bank to invest in a social entrepreneurship and innovation project for youth who were basically school dropouts. That's not the right term, but that's the colloquial term. They're kids who the system failed, who don't have an education, yet they're probably really resourceful and have really good ideas. So I think the risk tolerance that the private sector has and that impact investors have would be really useful in a context where you need to have a high risk tolerance because we need to create a stronger ecosystem for it. So I think people are natural entrepreneurs, whether they're indigenous or poor or they were in a gang, or if you're involved in a life of crime, you're probably really resourceful, and there are probably skills you have that if you're able to transfer those skills into another context would probably generate value for our countries. So I think the ecosystem is changing in these countries for that, and I do think there's an opportunity to do that, but I think we need to also focus on enabling and providing these opportunities that are driven by young people, not always come with a solution. Like, you need this kind of alternative energy, or you need this. No, more like, what do you need? And what is, and understanding the demand, not just from an economic standpoint, but from a social standpoint as well. So, and then as far as stakeholders, it's definitely not like un encerrón. It's not like, let's all meet, let's have the mayor sit with the community leaders. And no, it's a huge process. And at least from my experience, I've found that the best way to start it off is by doing something in the community that's like addressing some concrete problem together physically and in a space without necessarily talking about it, to start generating more trust. And I think it's a long-term process, but it's the aligning visions, I think, has to be done through action, not always sitting around a table. And when you act together, then you start realizing you have more in common. But we definitely like to sit people around the table that don't like each other all the time. That discomfort is, I think, where the best magic happens, definitely.
Well, thank you guys so much for this conversation. And if anybody's interested in what Sebastian or Selena does, don't hesitate to contact them. Thank you guys, and thank you.
Okay. Now we are having the two more moments. I know that we are all tired. It has been a lot. We have a lot to discuss, to address in a systemic way what we are passing our region and world. So for this panel, we are going to talk about new political practices. We all know that we are facing political crisis, not just in Brazil or other countries in Latin America, but this is a thing that is a global issue that we are passing, and a lot of polarization aspects of our politics. So how can we understand another perspective in an innovative way? So I would like to ask and invite Rafael Poço. He's a lawyer and he's part of Update Institute, and they are doing a big research in Latin America about the new political practices. And Alexandre Zeitouni, he's the vice-mayor of Guarulhos City. And we are going to change for Spanish, if it's okay for most of the plenary. Is it okay? Can you raise your hand if it's okay? Ok, entonces vamos a hablar en español ahora, y si tiene otras personas que no pueden hablar español, se pueden sentar cerca de otros que pueden traducir, sería mejor, ¿ok? Sorry, if you can sit close to someone that can translate to you, would be great for us. Okay? No, they will organize themselves, I think. Entonces, Rafael, ¿puede hablar un poquito? Tú vas a hablar primero, ¿no? ¿O mejor? Ok, entonces, sería interesante, Alexandre, que si tú puedes hablar un poquito de tu experiencia desde un punto de vista de poder ejecutivo y cómo es la relación que tu experiencia con el sistema político, tu visión de cómo podemos mejorar estas relaciones, principalmente también traer un punto de vista de una relación no solo dentro del sistema, porque yo sé que tú tienes este punto de vista, pero también una proximidad mayor, más grande con la población, con los ciudadanos, y cómo podemos establecer una relación más colaborativa con ellos también.
Muito bom. Vou pedir desculpas para falar em português e você, dentro das possibilidades, vai traduzindo também.
Ele vai falar em português e desculpa que solamente habla português.
Fazer uma saudação a NEXUS, ao Rafa, meu colega de painel, a Thalita.
Saludo NEXUS, Rafael, Thalita.
E dizer que essa experiência está sendo muito válida.
Essa experiência é muito válida.
Porque demonstra a exata medida da tamanha obsolência do sistema. O sistema público brasileiro é um sistema obsoleto.
Porque demonstra a obsolidade do sistema político, particularmente de Brasil, que é a experiência que ele tem.
E me parece que esse modelo não é por acaso. É um modelo realmente de domínio, de dominantes e dominados.
E este modelo não é por um acaso. Este modelo parece que foi como pensado assim, que alguns que dominam e outros que são dominados.
Mesmo porque, para se rodar qualquer política pública, tanto políticas públicas que vocês mesmo apresentaram aqui, como ONGs e como até iniciativa privada.
Porque para que podemos implementar políticas públicas desde a sociedade civil, com ONGs e outras alianças,
deve-se pedir para os detentores dos mandatos, para os vereadores, para os diretores, para os ministros, para os presidentes, para os prefeitos.
Temos que ter apoios de várias instâncias do poder público, ¿no? Lo legislativo, los ejecutivos, los diputados.
E isso tudo propõe a manutenção desse poder para os poderosos.
Y lo que pasa es que la forma que estamos organizados es una forma de mantener el padrón para mantener el poder con quien ya está concentrado de esta manera.
Nós, em Guarulhos, que é uma cidade, a maior cidade não capital da América do Sul,
Guarulhos es la ciudad más grande de América del Sur que no es capital.
conseguimos hackear a política.
Ellos están trayendo una experiencia que están hackeando la política. Entonces, dentro de la política, ¿qué pueden hacer para ser mejor y diferente de una forma más innovadora?
Hackeamos desenvolvendo um modelo sistêmico com ajustes aonde a sociedade participa efetivamente.
Desarrollando un modelo sistémico con el cual la sociedad puede participar activamente.
Que começou logo na nossa campanha. Nós éramos a quinta opção para se ganhar o pleito.
Que empezó desde la campaña porque ellos eran como la quinta opción en la candidatura como mayor desde las encuestas, en las encuestas.
E conseguimos, com um investimento 30 vezes menores que os nossos adversários, ganharmos as eleições.
Y consiguieron con poquísimas inversiones ganar las elecciones. La elección.
Isso tudo se deu por conta de uma intervenção da sociedade. A sociedade se enxergou no nosso programa e no nosso projeto.
Y esto se pasó porque ellos tuvieron mucho apoyo de la sociedad que se vieron en el programa de gobierno desde la campaña.
Nos 9 meses em que participamos efetivamente no governo,
en los 9 meses que él estaba en el gobierno,
conseguimos proporcionar resultados incríveis. Por exemplo, tiramos 11.500 crianças da fila da creche e até setembro tínhamos apenas 3.500.
consiguieron alcanzar resultados muy buenos y sacaron 11.500 niños y niñas que estaban en filas, no hay filas, colas de escuelas esperando por vagas, guardería, y se pusieron e integraron en el sistema educacional.
Ao mesmo tempo que conseguimos, dentro de uma política cultural, que é uma política de borda de governos,
Y consiguieron, desde una perspectiva cultural, de una política cultural del gobierno,
tínhamos 900 alunos num conservatório municipal. Em setembro já tínhamos 4.500 alunos.
habrían 900 alumnos en el conservatorio, en un centro cultural, y después 4.500 alumnos.
Através de